Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our last session of the Color of Law Book Club. We're excited that you were able to join us this evening. We know that we had to reschedule last week due to weather, so I hope everybody was able to stay safe. We would like to thank both sponsors for ULI Louisiana and ULI Triangle for helping us to be able to put on our event series. And with that said, I think we're going to go ahead and jump right in to the session today. We're going to start with facilitation by both Chris Tyson and Anita Brown Graham. And then we will go into our breakout rooms for discussion questions. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Natasha. Hi, everyone. Hi, Anita. I see you're there over here in the far right corner of my Brady Bunch screen.
Isn't it amazing Brady Bunch figured out how to do this before, even Zoom?
They were ahead of their time. Well, it's good to have you all back with us for this is our final session of the book talk, and I hope you have enjoyed The Color of Law and our exploration thus far. This evening we are wrapping up with chapters 10 through 12, the end of the book, and I know in the breakout sessions we're going to have an opportunity to continue our conversation on some of the themes covered here, but obviously as we approach this ending, I know we're all reflecting on the total work and everything that we've learned and uncovered throughout this process, and so we certainly invite discussion and questions about that as well. Anita, I think we're starting with chapter 10. This is on suppressed incomes. And I certainly want you to chime in as well, Anita. But, you know, Rothstein has been walking us through, piece by piece, a mosaic of private and public discriminatory devices, structures, processes, and systems that were designed to exclude Black people from this process of building the modern American middle class through housing and urban development. And as we're seeing through the stories that he's telling, we are witnessing the modern development, the development of the modern American city and the modern American metropolis, the interstates, the housing finance systems, the different districts within metropolitan areas, the park system, what we consider to be public assets and amenities that we appreciate in cities. We are coming to understand the underlying racialized logics in the development of all of this in ways that I think recast for us what we know about the cities and places that we live and call home, and the tapestry of urban communities which make up our national community. So I think as Rothstein has been breaking this down for us, I think as we arrive at chapter 10, we're kind of used to these components, if you will, of this much broader discriminatory system. And in chapter 10, he's focused on suppressed incomes. The title says it all, right? That on top of the federal policy, on top of the actions of local lawmakers and policymakers who are implementing federal mandates, on top of the vigilante violence that we are seeing, on top of the nonprofit and civic associations that are also leveraging these tools, we also have the devices of wage theft. And I use that term very specifically, right? Wage theft, the lost wages for Black labor, which is a loss of capital and an opportunity cost to build wealth, to be transferred across generations, and even to access these burgeoning tools of the American middle class as they are being formed. So you're not only legally excluded out of them to the extent that you may have a road to access, your incomes are being structurally and systemically suppressed. And so I think Rothstein walks us through in this chapter the actions of employers. Obviously, he takes us back to the New Deal, and we think about the labor that is created through New Deal policy, right? Federal resources deployed to employ people as in the wake of the stock market crash, how that is racialized. We understand how unions are also protecting white labor at the expense of Black labor participation. And to the extent that Blacks can participate is often much later than whites gain entrance, and also at lower wages. We are talking about everything from the post office, A. Philip Randolph's movement, various trade workers. And this is also not just about the ability to earn income. It's also about the ability to build skills, to participate in the professional development that occurs in the workplace and through vocations and jobs, all of which kind of support one's ability to support a family and himself, to find fulfillment in work, and to move themselves through a career and a life that we all take for granted, right? And there are certainly many pressures outside of race impacting one's ability to access and maintain gainful and fulfilling employment. So when we think about adding race into that, we can imagine the difficulties for Black workers during this period. Anita, anything to add there as you kind of move through chapter 10? You're on mute. You're on mute, Anita.
I keep telling people I say the best things when I'm on mute. As a person who resides in a right-to-work state where unions are by definition not as strong as they are in other places, I was particularly struck by the role that unions played in suppressing African American wages. I don't know if that was true for you, but it just seemed almost ironic that the organizations that were responsible for what we now all agree created a middle class by collective bargaining were so intentionally exclusive to their African American members. So I just wondered if you might say a few words about that.
Yeah, so I don't know if we have any labor historians on the call. I certainly am not one, and so I want to cite that before I comment, because there is a voluminous body of work about the labor movement and the racialized and gendered ways that the labor movement developed to the detriment of Black people, people of color in general, including, if you look out west, Latino workers in farms. And in the initial years, different European ethnic groups. There's, I believe is it Ira Katznelson's book, How the Irish Became White, talking about the development of white identity in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. That had played a big role in the labor movement. I think part of what we can say about that is that, like other social movements, and I would start with abolition into the women's movement, the suffrage movement, into the labor movement, you always have the threat of the racial bribe, right? Which is to say that these movements are often weakened by the appeal, often to white voters and often to white members and white male members in particular, that, you know what, you're not like these other people. You're not like these women. You're not like these people of color, these Black people, and we'll look out for you. We'll give you this in exchange for your allegiance here. Those dynamics still operate in our politics today, and I think they are in high relief as we kind of read about the movements that are occurring in labor at this period. We see this in some parts of the country. You know, I grew up in the Deep South, and so it was normal to see Black people in low-level service jobs. It is somewhat commonplace to see them in more unionized construction trades and building trades. If you go places, when I moved to Boston, I lived in Boston for 2 years. You know, strong working class city, right? Big history of Irish and Italian, European ethnic communities there. And one of the things I found jarring was that from the post office to the McDonald's to the construction sites, I rarely saw workers of color. And that struck me growing up in the South, and you know, Boston in particular. I don't mean to pick on that city, and please, anybody from Boston, chime in. But that city in particular has a very well documented history of racialized labor strife with regards to unions and racialized and even inter-white ethnic battles over who has access to the benefits of unionization and collective bargaining. So it did not surprise me in here, because I know that history exists and is a deep history, and you could write a book of this length just on that history. But it certainly is helpful for us to, again, you know, paint this picture of the myriad of forces conspiring against middle class or even working class stability for Black laborers and would-be homeowners.
Yeah, those words, the myriad of forces, will haunt me later tonight. So we can move to chapter 12.
Yes.
Which is looking forward, looking back. And I want to confess right now that this chapter was the first place in the book that I got really mad at Rothstein, because I so violently disagreed with what he was saying. Let me just read something from my notes here. He says school segregation is more complex. He's talking about the forms of discrimination that are really straightforward to roll back. And I take issue with that in and of itself, because I don't know that anybody would say we're where we thought we would be on voting rights or hiring discrimination. But I hear his point that that's mostly in the implementation of law and policy rather than the failure of them to address the issues. He says, school segregation is more complex, but it is still clear how to fix it. Provide schools of comparable equity, comparable quality, and ensure schools are integrated. And so I just want to stop there for a moment, because I feel like Rothstein is the guy I know on the faculty at any university, including the one in which I teach, who presumes that whatever their issue is the biggest problem there is in the world, and everything else is fixable. I would not disagree at all that school segregation is tied to housing segregation, and that our failure to find meaningful interventions to integrate communities has an effect on school segregation. But I would beg those of you listening tonight to just weigh in the chat box on this issue of whether school segregation is all about housing segregation, which is how I think it is presented in this book. So I would say for the most part, the data, at least in the state where I live, North Carolina, and the state where I've done research, is pretty clear that there are neighborhoods that are integrated that are feeders to schools that are still segregated. And the challenge is really about white flight from public schools. So to the extent that public policy supports more charter schools, more vouchers for private schools, just sort of more opportunity to support people abandoning public schools, whether those people are Black or white, they tend to end up in more segregated schools than the ones they left, and they leave the public schools more segregated than they otherwise might be. So I just feel that Rothstein's aim at solutions around this really important problem, and one that I think actually bears a lot of opportunity for thinking about how kids grow up and want to live in more integrated neighborhoods, is one that sort of doesn't recognize the relationship between the cart and the horse. So I'll hand it over to you, Chris, to respond.
So I think that as I got to this part of the book, and it didn't, I think all of your points are very well taken. That particular point did not leap out to me as much as some of the others at this point in the book. But as a general note, I think some of the force of Rothstein's argument kind of diminishes as we get to the end, where I think he starts generalizing to a higher level of abstraction than I think is worthy of the first, I would say 75% of the book, if that's, and that's just a light criticism that I would offer. But, in this looking forward and looking back, where Rothstein is beginning to try to make some summary points about this, I think your points are well taken about schooling and school segregation as not solely being a function of housing. In places like Baton Rouge, where your ability to opt out of the public school system by hopping boundaries simply wasn't as great of an opportunity as it was in other larger metropolitan areas like Detroit, for instance. And I can think about, we're talking a lot about the Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court these days. And, I always, on my short list of cases I wish were decided the other way, is the Milliken v. Bradley case from 1976 in Detroit, which sanctioned the segregation in the metropolitan area that was facilitated by white flight across municipal boundaries, right? And the ability to hold that wealth in suburban districts that were able to have their own school districts and therefore segregate in that way, undermining both the financial stability of the city and the complexion of the school system. Here in the South, the exit is into the private school system because you have much later formed suburban school districts in a place like this. Really, the suburbanization of schooling in a place like Baton Rouge is really of the last 15 years. One of the reasons I argue that Baton Rouge had a 43-year fight with school integration was because the cost of exit were that much higher for whites who really had no other place to go, right, and therefore resisted so strongly school integration. And when forced busing came, and it came late to Baton Rouge in 1981, you had 7,000 white students leave the school system within the first year. If you look at the forming of many of your parochial and private schools here, you find dates of the late 70s and early 80s. So that is a much more localized phenomena that I think deserves some nuanced treatment. I think it's hard to generalize at the level that he is attempting to do. And so I do share, I think your frustration is well placed in that regard.
I want to acknowledge some comments in the chat box if I can, and then I'll give things over to you to talk about the final chapter. Sally says, without children, I don't have a broad perspective, but I listened to the serial New York Times Nice White Parents podcast and learned a lot about education, discrimination, and activism. Would recommend. I haven't heard it, but it's now on my list of things to do this weekend. So thank you, Sally. Maisha says, I would say the solution of equitable funding to schools versus property taxes leading to underfunded schools. So I agree that obviously Rothstein has a point when he says we need equitable funding, but what you can't control for, whether that funding is coming from the state or it's coming from a county's property tax base, is what parents of differential means can do to supplement the school. So I think about my own two daughters as they were going through school and how ridiculous it was that at one school, a parent could write a $10,000 check and have their corporation match it to help buy band uniforms. And at another school, you're literally doing like chicken barbecue dinners for 6 months in a row to see if you can come up with enough funding. So that's part of the challenge, I think, to Rothstein's approach is, while he says that this is one of the areas where you just have to get the first part right, the reality is that the layers of difference and inequities in communities find themselves in schools no matter where the starting place is for funding. And then I think that leads into John's point. Hi, John, who says, and to bolster Anita's point, even in integrated schools, Black children are more likely to get tracked into less academic tracks than similar situated white students. So even when you get integration, you don't actually get the benefits, the full benefits of integration. And then the final one is the underfunding is a holdover from Jim Crow, where counties in Alabama had funding differences of $32 to $7 for a student in public schools. And again, yeah, you gotta get the funding right,
Yeah.
but often it's not enough.
But I do think one of the things, and just in your example of a parent who can write a $10,000 check and have their corporation match it. What I do think, to his credit, Rothstein is talking about in this looking forward, looking back, he's talking about the racial wealth gap. And I think it's important to understand that having access to corporate jobs, right, which is a function of a number of things that are cumulative from history, right? And in corporations that have a plan to match you $10,000 and having $10,000 available to make as a donation, which may be home equity that is being borrowed, may be a grandparent's wealth and income that was built up over decades of having a stable union job, or a home in a neighborhood that was protected from infiltration from undesirable others like Black people. All of those structures of wealth creation, right, are now coming to bear and show up in the substantial wealth gap that we have. And what I'm always trying to get people to understand is that all of this policy history and lineage, right, is legal and policy history, is not in the past, right? This is how it shows up. And so there, there are, the white family who earns $100,000 a year. I'm using round numbers here because this math probably isn't going to work in real life. Just for the sake of round numbers, the white family that earns $100,000 a year and the Black family that earns $100,000 a year, if you ask me which one of those had the ability to write a $10,000 check and a donation, I in most cases know the answer, because I know this history of wage theft, of segregation, of being excluded. And so unless we know that, in the gap of that knowledge, there are a whole host of things that we pour into that. All types of stereotypes and reductive thinking about personal responsibility, who works hard, who is deserving, who is a better steward of their personal finances, who makes more discriminate purchases, and all of these things, none of which have any basis in data, right? All the data has debunked any of this, right? But they play into stereotypes of pathological bad decision-making or cultural bad decision-making in Black communities that would explain the welfare, right? People see a line outside of a Nike store when a new shoe comes out, and they say, see, those Black people don't know how to spend their money. And if they were all investing in the stock market, there wouldn't be a racial wealth gap. Well, the math of that should strike us as just bankrupt on its face, right? Like, wow, you think we can explain one maybe bad purchase or indulgent purchase? The truth of the matter is people of all races make indulgent purchases. They entertain themselves with things. We buy things because of a host of reasons that have nothing to do with racial pathology, and certainly don't explain the types of gaps we see between the races relative to wealth. And so I think we have to be careful, because much of what we think about the distribution of public resources, how we think about taxes, how we think about public financing, the social safety net, goes back to theories of deserts, right? Goes back to theories of worthiness, goes back to theories of entitlement, all of which connect to, origin stories that are mythologies that we tell ourselves, right?
I agree. But Chris, I do not disagree with you at all. And I think Rothstein is trying to demonstrate the complexities. He just set me on the wrong path.
Oh, no, you're
by suggesting school immigration was easy to fix.
No.
We're probably going to both get into a lot of trouble if we don't move on to chapter 12.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Let's go. And so this, for me, was the kind of flat point of the book. There's some good history in here. I just as someone who is a political junkie, and this was before this book, but understood the controversy over HUD Secretary George Romney and his very aggressive approach to suburban funding suburban municipalities through HUD in the late 60s and early 70s, earning him a dismissal from the Nixon White House, which I'm sure on the day he was dismissed, he thought was a bad thing, but he just missed Watergate. So in hindsight, it was probably the best thing that happened to him. But, and so that type of activism of Romney in the late 60s or 70s, right in the aftermath of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, where we probably had the greatest political will to have meaningful enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. And we know that over the last 40 years, not only have we had weak enforcement vis-a-vis using the Housing Act to limit racial segregation and the racialized distribution of development dollars in metropolitan areas, but we're now seeing a rollback of that. I mean, the Obama administration made notable advancements on the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which is one of the linchpins of the Fair Housing Act, which has never been enforced with any meaningful heft. And we've seen the Trump administration roll that back. And so I think it's important to understand those. We talk about inclusionary zoning in here and some of the fixes. I think largely, though, I was underwhelmed by this chapter and where Rothstein leaves us. I think he kind of builds a really big, straw man to kind of say, it's a complicated situation. Hopefully we can fix it. Good luck. And this, so for me, this was probably the weakest part of the book, and maybe the most disappointing. I would have liked to have seen more imagination and more, just a more aggressive approach. And I think the book sets us up for that, but this chapter doesn't deliver. So that's my take.
I agree. It's sort of, these are big problems. And we get that, and we respect they're not easy to solve. And certainly after all this research, he respects too, that they're not easy to solve. But I felt there was a lack of creativity in the responses he offered. And given how critical he was of every other response that had been offered, you would think he would have a better idea, but there was none of that.
Well, and there are good ideas. There are many ideas out there. I think that I think that Rothstein is where many people are. And that is a fairly conservative political imagination of what we can do to fix these things, because the politics are divisive.
So when you say conservative imagination, you mean in a partisan way, not necessarily.
No, I actually don't mean in a partisan way.
Conservative, because I actually think.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you for asking for clarification, because I have to be careful about using those terms. No, I actually don't mean in a partisan way. I don't mean in a kind of left right, Democrat Republican type of way. I mean in a breadth, in terms of the breadth of his imagination. I feel is relatively constrained in this part of the book, as opposed to the fullness of his critique in other parts of the book. I think that we see a number of innovations around the country with rethinking land ownership, home ownership, cooperatives, thinking about race audits as a condition of receiving federal funding for local communities. There are a host of tools that we can imagine to compel cities. I mean, one of the things that I hate to get real law professor here, right? But one of the things we're observing and throughout Rothstein's project is our federalism, right? And kind of federalism all the way down, and understanding how federal policy prerogatives are devolved to the local level, where local actors have considerable decision-making authority for implementation of these federal aims, and have dollars attached to it. And so we can talk about the limits of fiscal federalism in a legal context, but we do have, I think, room to think about how we enforce some of these anti-racist goals at the local level through policy. And certainly, affirmatively furthering fair housing does that, and we see how that has been dealt with in HUD. There are other tools, and he talks about some of these, but I think.
So let me ask you this question, Chris, because we've got, I don't know, 6 minutes left to talk about if we were king and queen for the day, what we would do differently. I think I'm in agreement with Rothstein that if I had to pick a place to start, it would be in housing, because that is the opportunity to generate wealth. And to the point that you made earlier, income is important, but we've had enough years of experience to understand that just giving people an opportunity for equal income does not equate to giving them an opportunity for equal wealth. So even though Rothstein says it's too late, forget it, housing is unaffordable, and you can't, and I think he's got a statement that basically says, even if you do away with discrimination, the affordability issue is such that you have done nothing, which was a pretty depressing statement for me, right? But it feels to me that home ownership is still a valued pathway to wealth creation and to intergenerational wealth creation, and more time and thought needs to be given to how we offer that to more people. Would you agree with that?
I agree with this caveat. I agree with an asterisk. And that
Well,
is,
you are such the law professor.
and look, I speak as a homeowner, as a real estate investor, as a public and private developer. Um, I do want us to think more expansively about housing as a human need and not just a wealth creating tool. And I do want us to think about how do we create, because I believe that housing is a foundation, not just for wealth creation, but also for family stability, for anti-poverty, for healthy communities, for intergenerational stability within families. And I think all of those things, I want you to have that whether you have a mortgage or never have a mortgage. And we know that many families will go through life and never own a home. Most of the energy I fear, right, and this is my fear, around home ownership is going to benefit people like me. Who are well positioned to benefit from all of the structures and incentives that we throw at homeowners, and that there is a segment of the American population that gets behind because we only see housing as a commodity and not a human need. So
Well,
that's my issue.
why does that have to be? So the Malone person that Rothstein talks about, who helped to build homes in Levittown, but then had to buy a house outside of Levittown. Why couldn't we have public policy that would have supported the appreciation of his home in the way that the homes in Levittown appreciated?
Absolutely, right? And so, but I think what we would need is very robust policy structures to overcome the strong private tendency to discriminate in that instance. So, you know, you're talking about really binding developers to developing neighborhoods of mixed incomes that.
So are you an inclusionary zoning fan?
I am, and obviously the devil's in the details and the right policy. But I am a fan of inclusionary zoning. I do think we need to advocate for more mixed income neighborhoods. Most of our cities are not built for that. I frankly don't live in a mixed income neighborhood. And so as we think about, in my work as a urban developer in this role, certainly we need to be thinking about building mixed income neighborhoods and incentivizing the production of mixed income housing. But also in doing so, right, having the wraparound supports that lower income families need in close proximity to that housing. And look, that creates controversies when people want to live in areas that are surrounded by the symbols and accoutrements of affluence. And view the very presence of low-income people, and particularly the services and amenities they need to survive, as being unattractive or kind of inhibiting value creation in a more affluent landscape. And so you look at cities like, I always take DC because I spend a lot of time there. The attraction of affluence ambition in DC, right? And the remaking of neighborhoods into monikers of all of the symbols of capitalism, right? And just, you know, all of the big brand names and all of this in the neighborhoods, those are not accessible places for working class and poor people. You know, who can't spend $8 every day on a cup of coffee. And so if you're going to create truly mixed income neighborhoods, then your retail has to be mixed income, your services have to be mixed income, your modes of transportation have to be mixed income. And that's a much broader project, I think, than we often think about in urban development. So I'll stop there. But.
We have a number of really good comments in the chat box. And
yeah, I see.
We should probably address some of those, and until Nicole and Natasha get online and tell us to shut up. Let's just go for it.
Let's go for it.
Let's go rogue if we can.
We have a 10-minute buffer, so I'll allow it.
Okay, thank you. So Mia writes, "Hey moderators, hope it's not too off topic. No such thing, we're just having fun. But I'm consistently curious to know how much retroactive policy we can expect in the face of a pandemic. On one hand, Black people are historically more decimated by disaster. The constantly shifting priorities may push racial inequity even further down. What do you think?" I think yes. So no question that what we have seen is, somebody said once, when America gets a cold, Black people catch the flu. And so when we look at the number of people who are losing their homes, losing their small businesses, having to drop out of post-secondary education, and quite frankly, losing their lives, African Americans are faring much worse in this pandemic than the national averages. Chris, do you want to respond to that? And on your question of retroactive policy, my crystal ball doesn't tell me anything about what we can expect to see.
Yeah, so obviously, we can't talk about anything in the political and policy realm without thinking about the impact of a pandemic that has claimed now over 200,000 lives in this country and is impacting everything, particularly the role of government in society, right? As we are propping up barely an economy, and we know that is in a very precarious state depending on what Congress does going forward. So, but I'm not sure that retroactive policy, speaking broadly, I'm not sure that COVID is the greatest threat to that. I think with where we are likely headed with the ideological bent of the Supreme Court, where we already with the gridlock in Congress. Underlying all of this are fundamental questions about what is the role of the state, and to what extent do we look for government and policy and law to intervene, to regulate, to subsidize, and to redistribute. Or do we leave those things to the market and to private relations to solve? And I think those are questions that there are sharp divisions about in the country now. And I'm obviously speaking not to. I'm not trying to be partisan in this moment. I really am trying to underscore some of the just kind of big picture things we need to think about. But those are the questions. What we do know from Rothstein's book is that the racial and spatial stratification, as I like to call it, that characterizes virtually every American metropolis today, is the direct result, right, of intentional legal and policy action with the full force of the federal government over the entirety of the 20th century. At least, right? And so if we start there, then the question about what should be the role of government, I think there is a moral and a practical obligation to repair that. What that looks like and on what terms and to what degree is where it's an ideological battle that has been ongoing for a long time and continues and will be with us certainly given what's happening in the current news cycle for some time. Let's see. Well, Anita, you're on mute again.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was going to say I think we will probably turn things over to Nicole and Natasha at this point. But I really appreciate the comments in the chat box. It's like I agree with Anita. I think I'm more towards Christopher on this issue. To Chris's point, so
Let's see.
Really what we see here is a real tension, and I actually agree with you 100% on what is the point of housing, and is it about shelter or is it about wealth creation? And clearly for different families, it means different things. I love the notice in the chat box that, there's some countries where nobody's interested in home ownership.
Mhm.
But that's because they have a different tax structure and you are rewarded for home ownership, right?
And so I think that's so important, Anita, because I do think we always have to realize, and this is another underlying point that I do think Rothstein makes well, is that home ownership or neighborhoods or suburbs or urban or ghettos, none of these things are pre-political. None of these things are natural. They don't fall out of the sky. They are the result of particular choices in what we choose to incentivize, reward, encourage, and subsidize, right? And so the fact that, I like home ownership. I like home ownership because it's a way to shelter my income. It's a way to pass, on wealth to the next generation. It's tax-free in many ways. And I get the shelter benefits, and I get the status benefits, right? And so our culture, our economy, our tax code, everything is organized around me being a homeowner in ways that I probably haven't even psychologically uncovered, because that's how ingrained it is in our society. So I do want to be self-aware, right, when we're talking about home ownership, in knowing that I am somebody, I'm a minority, right? I'm a Black kid who's never lived in a home that wasn't owned by his parents or someone. I now own a home. I now invest in real estate. I'm probably not the best person to ask about what is the optimum, design for our housing system, as I'm on the extreme end of those who benefit from the current arrangement. And so, I want us to kind of always, as Black feminists have taught us, understand where and when and how we enter these discussions, and then begin to deconstruct that position as we think about what the optimum situation is. Because I'm sure I would feel different if I had been homeless, if I've never owned a house, right? If I am facing inflated rent, if I'm being gentrified out of a neighborhood, if I am shuffling my kids from house to house year to year and they never have a chance to connect with a place or feel stability in space of their own. And so that's just what I don't want to lose sight of. And I'm always pushing people to think about when we think about home ownership.
Okay, I got one last question for you, and then I'm definitely giving things over. I'll go ahead and be transparent. If I had to pick another area for investment, it would be education. But I just think in today's world, as the future of work changes, unless you have access to a quality education, it will be hard for you. It will become harder and harder for you to earn a living wage. That's me. But what would your area be?
Living wage. Because I think I think in the reverse, right? I think if you don't have income stability in your home, if you can't meet your basic needs, it's very hard to learn. And if your parents are having to string together 3 minimum wage jobs just to make ends meet, then I don't think you have the best conditions to learn outside of the 8 hours that you are in the academic institution, right? Like those other 16 hours, I'm concerned about if there's not food in the house, if there aren't basic necessities. And so I am concerned that I think, there are families out there who are experiencing wage theft and do not have, after a hard day's work, enough income to make ends meet. So we're flipped on that. But I'm often
I love it.
I'm often in the minority on that, because I have these back and forth with people who say, that's education. I'm like, yeah, but what if you can't eat? So yeah.
All right, Nicole,
Right.
Natasha.
Well, I hate to stop the conversation, but everybody else I think would love to have their own chance to have conversation.
Yes.
I'm gonna break everybody into the breakout rooms. We have about 30 minutes slotted, which will then leave us like 5 minutes to reconvene. I have a very quick poll at the end of the session, so I'm just gonna open up the breakout rooms and give you 30 minutes.